Hey there, welcome to Witchy Wednesday, your weekly astrology forecast. I'm Lara, and this forecast is for the week of May 15th to 21st, 2019. So welcome and thank you for being here, whether this is your first time or, you're a regular or you just stop in every once in a while when you're curious about what's going on. I really appreciate you being here. If these messages resonate with you, then please let me know by liking the video, subscribing, sharing, commenting, all of that. And of course, if you're interested in getting your own personal reading or finding out more about that, you can visit my website, and the link is always below here. So we have lots of shifts in energy going on this week. There's a lot happening, and that's all kind of circling around this full moon we have coming up on Saturday the 18th in the sign of Scorpio at 27 degrees Scorpio. It's happening on the 18th, 5:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you can adjust for your own time zone. It depends. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, it's happening on the 19th rather than the 18th. So we're going to talk in more detail and more depth because it is the full moon in Scorpio, which is all about depth. We're going to talk about that in a little bit, and we're going to go through each of the signs and talk about where this is impacting you and, the axis that this full moon is happening on. But there are some other things I want to address before we get there. And before I even do that, I want to mention to you, if you've been here before, you might be realizing that the angle I'm shooting from is a little bit different today. And that's really was prompted by the fact that I ran out of printer ink right before I recorded, because normally I like to have my page of notes printed out. And anyways, I have the laptop right in front of me instead today, and seems to be working okay. And so if you see me looking down, I'm just looking at my notes on my laptop, because you can't keep all of this stuff in your head all the time. At least I can't. So I have to have some notes to guide me. All right, so full moon, like I said, we're going to get to that. But before we get to that, today the moon is in Libra. It moves into Scorpio on Friday, then we'll have that full moon on Saturday, opposite the sun in Taurus. And on Saturday night, again, my time, Eastern Standard, it moves into Sagittarius and then Capricorn next Tuesday on the 21st. And why do I tell you about where the moon's at? Well, just very briefly, it can be really helpful to keep track of this for your own personal awareness. You can learn how you respond to the moon's cycles. And, depending on your own personal makeup, you may be more comfortable with the moon in certain areas of the chart, in certain signs. It just blends better with your own personal energy. But even beyond that, you can learn what kind of activities work well for you under certain moon energies. And even if, the moon's in a place where it may not be particularly comfortable for you, an awareness allows you to go, okay, well, the next couple days, might feel a little bit intense if the moon's in Scorpio, for example. And that may be awesome for you, and you may be comfortable with that, or you may not be, but at least having an awareness of it can be helpful. So alrighty, moving on. Like I said, a couple of other things I wanted to address before we really dive into the full moon, but it's all related. So this is why I'm telling you about these other things, and they're important. These are energies or transits that are happening that will impact us for more than just a couple of days at a time. And one of those is that Mars is shifting signs. So we have a lot of planetary energy shifting signs this week. And in fact, today, on Wednesday the 15th, we have Mars moving into Cancer and Venus entering Taurus, where she is at home. And so she feels really comfortable in Taurus. Mars in Cancer, bit of a different story. Mars was in Gemini and now is moving into Cancer. And when Mars moves into Cancer, we can feel our actions can be driven a little bit more by our moods, right? So we can act depending on what kind of mood we're in, because the Cancer energy brings, that element of kind of moodiness, ebbs and flows. Cancer's ruled by the moon, right? The ebbs and flows of the tides and our moods. It rules our emotions. And then Mars is that more masculine, young, driven force, driven energy. And when those two things come together, then we can feel driven by our moods, the ups and downs of our moods, right? Also, our actions might revolve around like emotional security. These are all Cancerian themes: home, family, nurturing, that kind of thing. And the only thing I would say, in terms of the perhaps lower vibrational quality of this energy, is to watch for being passive aggressive, or others being passive aggressive with you. Watch for that kind of aggression, and particularly when it involves your family or your tribe kind of thing, right? Your close peeps. And so that's the Mars in Cancer. And then we've got also Venus that I mentioned moving into Taurus, and Venus is at home in Taurus. Venus really likes to be in Taurus. It's a very comfortable place for Venus to be. And so she expresses her energies in a very practical, tangible, material, sensual way, right? Taurus is connected to the material world, the world of the five senses. And so when Venus is there, that's how she expresses herself, right? And so our relationships, our values, our worth, our self-worth, our resources, these are all things that Venus rules. And so she expresses those themes through Taurus while she's in Taurus, right? Which again, practical, tangible, sensual, these kinds of things. And the other thing is, as I just mentioned to you, when we've got, we always have a higher vibrational and a lower vibrational kind of quality to all of these energies. And so on the lower vibrational end, we can be more kind of possessive at this time. So driven by stability that we want to own people and things kind of when and hang on to that. But in general, it's a nice time for kind of pleasure seeking in whatever area of the chart Taurus falls for you. So when you're talking about, the shifts in these energies, look to the houses that hold Cancer, which is where Mars is moving, and Taurus in your chart. And you can then kind of get an idea of the area of life or the life themes that will be particularly impacted by the shifts in energy. And then the other shifts that we have happening are happening on Tuesday, May 21st, when we have the Sun leaving Taurus and entering Gemini, and Mercury entering Gemini, and Mercury is at home in Gemini, right? Mercury rules Gemini and also Virgo. And when we have the messenger planet moving into its home sign, it's very comfortable with that energy. And this combination of energy, Sun, Mercury, and Gemini, our focus can be more, it can be more scattered, for one thing, kind of, all over the map, or paying attention to a lot of different things. And we are particularly curious, perhaps, under this energy, sociable, communicative, those kinds of things, right? There's lots of information gathering and disseminating that goes on under this Mercury Gemini influence, but not necessarily discernment of the information. That's more a Virgo quality. So, we can be kind of bit social butterflies under this influence, which is great. It's getting to be that time of year around here, anyways, in the Northern Hemisphere, and where we get out and the weather gets a bit nicer, and we are talking to more people, doing more things, being more sociable, chatting, that sort of thing. So it lends well to that. And I would just say, caution against kind of spreading yourself too thin under this influence. So those are the shifts in energy. And I'm going to bring those things into the discussion of the full moon as well in just a minute. And I just wanted to give you a hint here. I mentioned to you, if you want to know where this energy is moving through your chart, look to the houses, right? That Cancer, Taurus, and Gemini sit. And it just so happens that those are beside each other in the chart. So Taurus, Gemini, and Cancer fall in that order in the zodiac. So, for example, if you know that, you have Taurus in the 9th house, well, then Gemini in the 10th, Cancer in the 11th, for example. Okay, just to give you a hint. And of course, if you don't know your own chart, or you don't have a chart, there are free places online. You can draw up your own chart with just a teeny bit of information and know-how. And if you want to learn a bit more about how to read your chart, if you have a reading with me, I always do an Astro 101 kind of lesson right off the top of the reading. I'm working on doing some courses and offerings. It's starting to gain momentum now, which is really good. But so stay tuned, stay tuned for that. I am really working on it. So you'll hear about that when the time comes. So before we get to the full moon in Scorpio, let's take a look at the chart. I drew up this chart for the actual full moon in Scorpio, which is Saturday the 18th, 5:11 Eastern Standard Time, right? Like I said, adjust accordingly. So hopefully this works at this angle when I show you the chart. But let's have a look here at, there's the moon in the sign of Scorpio at 27 degrees. Right opposite that is the sun at 27 Taurus, right? Now, a full moon, just to remind you, is always when the sun and moon are opposite each other in the sky. And then we've also got, there's Mercury in Taurus at the time of the full moon, but going to move into Gemini. And there we've got Venus there in Taurus. And we've got Uranus in Taurus. Now, Venus will have just entered here, I believe. Yes, and like just at the early degrees there, right near Uranus, right, conjunct Uranus, right? And what else do we have? We have, well, Neptune in Pisces for the long haul, Chiron and Aries for the long haul. We've got Mars down here that's just shifted into Cancer, right? And you can see 1 degree by the time of the full moon. And the North Node down there in Cancer, hanging out. Up here, Pluto, Saturn, South Node, all together, getting, Saturn and Pluto getting closer and closer together in the sign of Capricorn. And incidentally, this energy is making a supportive aspect, having a supportive conversation with this full moon. So, that's a good thing because there will be some intensity around this full moon. And I'll speak to that in just a minute. So I think those are the things that I wanted to talk to you about here. And yes, okay. And let's get on to discussing the actual full moon in Scorpio. So the full moon in Scorpio, this particular full moon in Scorpio is actually, it's called by some people a seasonal blue moon because it is the 4th blue moon after the spring equinox, or 4th full moon after the spring equinox, which was in March, right? And as I mentioned, and as you've heard me say before, kind of the key word for Scorpio is intensity. And a full moon is about our emotions, right? A full moon, the moon rules our emotions, our feelings, our unconscious. And so at the time of a full moon, we generally have heightened emotions, heightened sensitivities. But that is even more so the case when the moon is in Scorpio, because Scorpio feels things more deeply than any other sign of the zodiac, than any other energy of the zodiac. So when you have a moon in Scorpio, and I'm speaking from experience over here because my moon's in Scorpio, you feel all the feels. And when I mean all the feels, I mean all the feels. It's intense. It's intense. And it's very hard to articulate this to other people unless they have the same experience. And so, pardon me, when I do readings for people that have moon in Scorpio, or a lot of scorpionic energy in their chart, Plutonian energy in their chart, I feel like I'm specially qualified to do that because that's me. So, I can relate to this intensity, right? Scorpio is a fixed water sign. So think of the image of like a frozen lake teeming with life underneath. That's sort of an image, a visual that comes to mind. Or on the lower vibrational end, a stagnant pool, fixed water, right? So because Scorpio at its, the dark side of Scorpio has to do with clinging on to things and refusing to let go, like strong attachments to things, becoming emotionally stagnant, afraid to leave the comfort zone, and really wanting to control things, right? So power and control issues, obsession, can be a bit of an issue here. Secrets, deception, that sort of thing. But this is a very powerful, transformative energy as well, because Scorpio is not afraid to go to the depths, to look in all the cobwebby corners of things and, uncover what's there, to bring Scorpio's kind of superpower. I would, is to bring the darkness to the light. Again, it's the image of the phoenix rising from the ashes, but the phoenix burns up first. You've heard me say this before. So, this is the element of water that can transform, right? Ice melts into water, turns into vapor. Think of that kind of quality. Um, and so, Scorpio is a really good BS detector. People with strong Scorpio or Scorpio moons tend to, especially if there's, certain other things happening in the chart, but tend to be very, very, very good at uncovering, like detectives. Like, think of the Sherlock Holmes character. That's Scorpio moon in particular. And they know the truth even when it's not being spoken. Even when the person that they are communicating with, for example, isn't necessarily conscious of it themselves. So there's this ability. It's call it psychic if you will, to really get to the bottom of things, to understand and to see with eagle eyes what's going on below the surface, and to really feel that. And so that can be quite intense, right? So this a full moon is about culmination. It's about something coming to fruition. It's about something being illuminated. Um, you know, something, rising from the darkness to the light, really. And it's the sun and the moon are opposite each other in the sky, right? The moon is reflecting the light of the sun. And so under a Scorpio full moon, it's a really good time for releasing, cleansing, purging, bringing the dark to the light, and ultimately claiming your true, authentic power, which comes from a place inside, not external to you. right? We are not powerful because of how much we have, because of our title, because of who we control, because of, yeah, how much money we have, what kind of car we drive. That can be the shadow side of Scorpio in some ways. That is, true power has nothing to do with what's outside of you. So this can be a time of, claiming your true power and transforming your life in some way. So this is on a smaller scale, like on a smaller cycle. Whatever began at the time of the new moon in Taurus a couple of weeks ago, whatever seeds were planted there. Remember, I used the analogy in that video of terra preta, right? And if you didn't watch it, you can go back and watch. But it's about whatever we planted at that time coming to fruition, seeing the growth there. And on a grander scale, astrology is about cycles within cycles. We can look back to the new moon that happened in Scorpio in November 2018 and kind of see what began around that time for us that may be coming to fruition or being illuminated further at this time. So let's talk a little bit more before I go through the signs about the other energies playing into this full moon. So I mentioned to you that Mercury is changing signs, right? And moving into its home sign of Gemini, and is conjuncting the sun at the time of the full moon. So right beside the sun, opposite this full moon in Scorpio. So there is an element here of voicing or communicating or discovering, right? These are all Mercury kind of Gemini themes, who you are, and speaking from the heart. The sun is the heart of who we are. So there can be themes of speaking the truth, right? Potentially even speaking the truth or hearing the truth and not believing it, or you speaking the truth and somebody else not necessarily believing it. But ultimately, we know the truth when we feel it, right? And that's important when we're talking about Scorpio energy. It's not necessarily so much we know the truth when we hear it. We know the truth when we feel it in our gut, really. That's Scorpio. Trust that. Trust those instincts. And then we've got Venus conjunct Uranus in Taurus at the time of the full moon, right? So that can lend an element of surprise, Uranus, of rebellion, eccentricity, those kinds of things, Uranian themes, to what we value, Venus, right? At this time. So there can be like unexpected events surrounding relationships, love, money. Remember when I talked about, in last week's video, I talked about as all the personal planets transit Uranus and Taurus, right? They move, past Uranus and Taurus. There will be this kind of hit of, there will be a shakeup of that energy, of whatever that energy represents, or whatever that planet represents. And so this is that happening in regards to Venus. So the full moon in Scorpio opposite the sun in Venus, it emphasizes overall, for all of us, this axis in the chart of form, material form, that's Taurus, right? Sun in Taurus, versus transformation, which is the Scorpio piece. So, and it's also the axis of my possessions. That's Taurus. What I own, my resources, money, values, material possessions, worth, versus what is shared with others. So, what resources are shared with others. And also there is an element of the physical, Taurus, versus the more psychological, Scorpio. Simplicity, Taurus, versus complexity, Scorpio. Okay, so this is the axis that this is happening on for all of us. And then it's happening, wherever whatever the houses that Scorpio and Taurus sit for us, which are opposite each other in the chart, that's where we will experience this full moon energy the most. And incidentally, this full moon in Scorpio will most impact those people that have personal planets and points at around 24 to 30 degrees of the fixed signs, which are Taurus, Scorpio, Leo, and Aquarius, or the very beginning of the mutable signs, so like 0 to 2, 0 to 3 degrees of Gemini, Sagittarius, Virgo, and Pisces as well. So if you've got things happening around those areas of your chart, planets and points, then you may feel this more than others. So let's talk about the full moon in Scorpio opposite the sun in Taurus, right? Through the rising signs. And I say rising signs, if you've never been here before, the main focus with these general forecasts is the rising signs, because they are, when I'm speaking to rising sign, that's the most accurate, the most obvious in a general forecast. Also listen for your sun sign and your moon sign. Those will give you different layers of information. But as I've mentioned and as I've explained before, unless I have your personal chart in front of me, I don't know what house your sun falls in. But I do know that if you are, a Virgo rising, then you've got Libra in the second house, for example. So that's how that works. So the overall theme here, just to kind of bring it into a small little neat package before I go through each of the signs, is this full moon will bring about some deep insight. So it's like deep insight rising to the surface, right? Scorpio, the depths, Taurus is the surface. And it may be surprising with Venus conjuncting Uranus and Taurus. It may have different layers of meaning. It may mean, as I said, one thing on the surface and another thing at the depths. Whatever this message, Mercury, right, moving into Gemini, is that, or messages that we are getting that are coming to us around this time. So deep insight, rising to the surface, liberation, disruption, upheaval, truth. And so these are kind of some themes to keep in mind that surround the energies of this full moon. So the full moon in Scorpio. We're going to start with Scorpio because Scorpio, this is your full moon. It's happening in your sign at specifically 27 degrees. And interestingly, I recently did a reading for somebody who has their moon at exactly 27 degrees, Scorpio, and this is a super powerful time going on for this person. So interesting stuff. So Scorpio, this is happening in your first house opposite your seventh house, right? If you can hear some background noise, one of my cats is trying to get into the room right now. So, just hopefully ignore that and he'll go away. But Scorpio, first house, seventh house axis. So the relationship axis, the axis of me, that's the first house, and you, that's the seventh house. So me, myself, and I, my physical body, my physical vitality, how I instinctually get my needs met, my instinctual approach to life, my how I come across to others, how I appear to the external world, right? Versus me in relationship. So me in relationship to the other person, the one-to-one relationships in my life. This is where this moon is happening. But the full moon in the first house is an energy of something coming to fruition, culmination, something being illuminated in regards to the self, you as an individual. And perhaps there may be some tension to resolve there between you and another, or how you relate to yourself versus how you relate to others. Remember, when I talk about relationship, we always have to remember that we are in relationship to ourselves first and foremost, right? So that's a big piece. That's a key theme for you right now. Scorpio is the relationship you have to yourself, to your physical being, and to your instinctual approach to the world. So that's where this is happening for you. There may be some really deep emotions bubbling up around these themes right now for you, or some insights or something that began, you know, in the short term around the time of the Taurus new moon a couple weeks ago. In the longer term, perhaps in the fall of 2018. That's coming to the climax now. So that's for you, Scorpio. Moving on to Libra. Libra, this full moon in Scorpio is happening in your second house opposite your eighth house. And so this is the axis of form, that's the second house, versus transformation, that's the eighth house, right? This is the axis, the natural axis of Taurus and Scorpio. My resources versus shared resources, the material versus the psychological. These are the themes that govern that axis of the chart. And so with the full moon in Scorpio happening in your second house, some deep insight, some culmination, some fruition, some potentially crisis, some reaching the precipice, right, is happening for you in terms of second house themes. So your resources, your own personal resources, your values, your core values, what you value, your self-worth, your personal kind of possessions, right? Material possessions. These things are being highlighted and illuminated for you at this time. And this may involve that opposite energy of the eighth house of shared resources. And, remember how I said the message is coming through maybe at two different kind of levels, where there's the depths, right? And then what appears on the surface. And so this can be about, the material kind of trappings, the material world, that's second house, versus the psychological world. So the deep psychological insights that may be happening for you right now in relation to those second house issues. So that's for you, Libra. Moving on to Virgo, and we've got the full moon happening in your third house, Virgo. And so this is opposite the ninth house, right? And this is the axis of the lower mind versus the higher mind. It's the axis of communication. So it's kind of like day-to-day communications and interactions and exchanges of information versus the bigger picture. So for you, Virgo, the full moon in Scorpio in the third is really illuminating your area of communications, and it may involve your immediate environment, so your neighborhood, your community, your siblings, your peers, your cousins, even things like how you communicate, your style of communication, messages that come in and go out on the day-to-day that are exchanged between people. This can involve writing sometimes as well. So there's these deep scorpionic insights and perhaps intense emotions surrounding these themes and playing off that ninth house of what's the bigger picture, what are what's my overall worldview and philosophy, which is all ninth house matters, what's happening in relation to perhaps teaching, learning, foreign cultures, just like, again, it's easy for me to give examples from my personal life. I'm a Virgo rising, so just to give you an example here, on the full moon, my husband, this is the long weekend here. My husband has to travel far away for work, to go overseas to the Netherlands. And so, travel, um, long distance, all of that, access of communication, I'll be more at home, actually, making a short trip, which is third house, to the lake with my kids. And there'll be some siblings, some cousins, third house there. And, we'll be communicating with my husband at a distance. So you see, this is kind of how this works, right? I mean, there are other themes, but that's just a simple example. And so that's where this full moon is happening for you, Virgo, in that third house of communications. And we're going to move on to Leo now, where we've got the full moon happening in your fourth house. Full moon in Scorpio in the fourth house, Leo, which is the house of home and family and place of living and your close tribe, the people that you're related to or the people that feel like family. It's private versus the public, the 10th house opposite the chart, right? Which is public life, your career. It's the external versus the internal, which is the fourth house, internal. And so the Scorpio full moon is bringing things to light, is, there is some culmination coming to fruition, happening in this area of the chart that has to do with whatever goes on at home, whatever involves your family and your private life, your emotional security, potentially involving the mother or a mother type figure. This is where this intensity is happening for you, Leo. So, be mindful of that. Emotions may bubble up to the surface to be dealt with. Messages may come in that require you to look at things from not only the surface level, but from, a deeper kind of more psychological level as well around these themes. So that's for you. And moving on to Gemini now, we've got the full moon happening in your fifth house, Gemini. So opposite the 11th house. So this is the house of the individual, the fifth house, the individual creative kind of pursuits, how we have fun in life, our children, what we create, right? Our children that we are associated with, versus the 11th house, which is the collective. So my own creations versus collaborations kind of thing. And so with the full moon happening in the fifth house, there may be some emotional realizations, intensity, things coming to light, some culmination, things coming to fruition regarding these fifth house themes of, your children you work with, how you have fun. It can even involve like hobbies and that sort of thing, but romance, your creative pursuits, projects, creative self-expression, these kinds of things are being brought to light at the time of this full moon. And in relation to, the overall kind of themes and energies that I spoke about in the intro. So if you haven't listened to that, then please go back and do that. So that's for you, Cancer. Moving on to Gemini, we've got the full moon happening in your sixth house. So this is the house of the day-to-day, the daily grind, your routines, your daily routines, your health and wellness routines. It's about, so it's opposite the 12th house, right? So it's the day-to-day kind of existence versus the more spiritual existence, spiritual life, 12th house. It is about work versus rest. It's about intentional daily actions, 6th house, versus, actions and routines versus more sort of unconscious behaviors. So those are some themes that govern that 6th, 12th house axis. But the full moon's happening in your 6th house, which is shining a light on, your daily routines, your health and wellness routines, those things I just spoke of. And there may be some intense emotions around that right now. There may be some insights, and there may be something coming to culmination that began around the time of the Taurus new moon a couple of weeks ago, or something that even, started around the time of the new moon in Scorpio back in the fall of 2018, coming to fruition here, coming to culmination, right? So that's the area where this is playing out for you, Gemini. And I'm going to move on to Taurus now. Taurus, the full moon is happening in your seventh house. So same as Scorpio, but opposite, right? So for you, the actual full moon is happening in the sign of your one-to-one relationships. Sorry, in the house of your one-to-one relationships, the seventh house, opposite the house of self, which is the first house. So this is the relationship axis of you and me. But for you, the actual full moon is in the seventh house. So this is about the other. So something may be transpiring here, coming to fruition, coming to pass, coming to a crisis point, a culmination, an illumination, a deep insight, a bit of an emotional release happening around close personal relationships. So that can be a significant other, that can be a business partner, that can be somebody you are a rival, who you would consider your rival, or it can just be, any kind of close personal relationship that you have is being highlighted at the time of this full moon. All right, moving on to Aries. Aries, the full moon is happening in your eighth house. So again, same as Libra, but opposite, right? So the full moon is actually happening in that house of your shared resources, of transformation, of the psychological, opposite the second house, which is the house of form, material form, the house of your personal resources, the house of the material world. And so for you with the full moon in the eighth house, Aries, this is like something coming to fruition or culmination or in being illuminated in the house that governs our intimate connections, our shared resources, our deep psychological, insights and healing. And so something's going on at a very deep level for you. And the eighth house is the house that Scorpio is at home at. And so this has scorpionic themes to it, this full moon, particularly for you, Aries. So you can make sure you listen to the intro for further insight there. Moving on to Pisces. Pisces, this full moon is happening in your ninth house of the higher mind, right? Versus opposite the chart, the third house, the lower mind. So basically the big picture versus the day-to-day communications and insights and messages and teachings and learnings and that kind of thing. And the ninth house governs higher education. It governs travel, long distance travel, foreign cultures, governs our philosophy and our beliefs. You know, that kind of bigger picture kind of thinking and information. And so with the full moon happening there, something is coming to fruition for you with regard to those themes rather. Something's coming to culmination. It's reaching a crisis point. That doesn't have to be a bad thing, that word crisis, but it's reaching the precipice in some way. And only you personally in your own life will know what that is. So moving on to Aquarius now. Aquarius, this is happening in your 10th house of your public life, your public reputation, your career, your worldly ambitions, what happens in the external world versus the more private internal world of the fourth house, right? Which is about more home and your emotional security and your place of living and that kind of thing. So Aquarius, the 10th house is being illuminated for you. There may be some deep insights and emotions surrounding 10th house subject matter, which I just spoke of, right? Public kind of image, reputation, career, relationship to authority falls in this house as well. And so the Scorpio intensity is being brought to that 10th house for you over this full moon. Aquarius. So listen to the intro for some more kind of insight as to how these themes impact us overall. And moving on to Capricorn. Capricorn, your full moon is happening in the 11th house, right? The full moon in Scorpio. So that is the house of the collective. It's the house that governs our collaborations and our visions for the future. And so something is coming to pass there. Something's coming to fruition. There are some deep insights going on in regards to these things for you. And this may be something that was planted around the Taurus new moon, or it may be kind of like the culmination of a cycle that began in the fall of 2018 as well. So you can look back to that for some further insight as to how this might be playing out for you, Capricorn. And then last but not least, Sagittarius, the full moon is happening in your 12th house, opposite the 6th house. So this is the spiritual versus the day-to-day. Rest versus work, the unconscious behaviors versus sort of the intentional daily routines, right? And so for you, the 12th house Scorpio full moon may be particularly intense because it's sort of on an unseen level, and Scorpio plumbs the depths. So you know, it might be the depths of your kind of unconscious that are bubbling up to the surface, that are being illuminated right now. Something is being, you know, is coming to the surface in regards to those 12th house themes that I spoke about. And there is a culmination happening for you in this 12th house area, Sagittarius. And that may be something that began a couple weeks ago around the time of the Taurus moon, new moon, or in the fall of 2018 even. This, you know, part of a bigger cycle here, what's going on in the 12th house for you at a deep internal, perhaps unconscious even, behind closed doors kind of level. All right, so that is the full moon in Scorpio through all 12 signs. And I hope you come back and join me again next week for another Witchy Wednesday. And I really do appreciate you being here and all your support. Okay, hang in there. Join me on Facebook and Instagram as well for more frequent